Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Road to 2000. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and today I want to take you through some really exciting and interesting games from the first day of action at the US Women's Championship. It was a tumultuous day at the US Women's Championship today, with a lot of the players having a lot of decisive results, and we're going to see a couple players tonight that actually had only decisive results, never drawing a game. And the player I wanted to start with here is Wang. Wang is actually leading the tournament after one day of play. She is the only player to get to 2.5 points out of 3. There are a myriad of players following her with 2 out of 3, but she is the only one to get 2.5 out of 3. And in this game, she was up against Nguyen, who of course is also having a pretty interesting tournament here. A lot of wins, and one or two, or I think just one loss here against Wang. And we're going to see another game of Emily's later tonight, and maybe that game goes better for her. But here, she's up against Wang, and let's see what happens. She goes d4, Annie responds knight f6, knight f3, keeping it simple, not really committing to anything. You see players play knight f3 earlier and earlier these days, sometimes even before c4, as in this game, mainly because, you know, the standard c4, e6, knight c3, d5. This is sort of seen as the ideal queen's gambit for white in many cases, but of course this allows the Nimzo Indian, which these days fewer and fewer players with the white pieces are happy to allow. So you see players play knight f3 instead, not yet committing the knight to the c3 square, for the purpose of getting black to commit to something in the center before allowing this bishop out to b4. In this game, we see e6, c4, d5, and now only after d5, white plays the move knight c3. And is bishop b4 still a playable move? Well, of course it is. This is just the Ragozin defense, but now the point is that a lot of annoying Nimzo Indian lines have actually been avoided by having black commit to this pawn on d5, and as we'll see in the game, perhaps white has a few extra options thanks to this diagonal being open and what black having committed to this pawn on d5. To start with, we see c takes d5, e takes d5. Black definitely needs to take back with the pawn to maintain control over this e4 square. And now white immediately goes out with the move queen a4 check, which at first glance seems to attack two pieces at the same time, which is pretty scary. Thankfully for Wang, there is a response to this, and that response is the simple move knight c6, blocking the check and defending the bishop. So with knight c6 in mind, why is white actually coming out with queen a4 and giving this check? Well, of course, c6, while it is the most natural square for the knight, black doesn't actually have the optimal setup here. That is because this knight is blocking in this pawn on c7, of course. This pawn would love to go either to c6 to support this pawn on d5, or out to c5 to actually pressure white's center on d4. With the knight on c6 though, this pawn is stuck for the moment, and black's pieces might find a little bit of awkwardness because of this. White continues development with bishop g5, getting the bishop outside the pawn chain before playing e3 and pinning this knight to the queen. Black goes ahead and castles. The main move is actually h6, but we'll see black transpose after castling first. e3 played, and now black does play the move h6, and I'm not so sure that there's really any reason for one move first over the other. I don't think Emily really missed any opportunity to punish this move order. I think it's just a direct transposition. And here, we're going to see white make a very interesting decision. So, there is a choice in front of the player with the white pieces. Do you preserve this bishop, something like bishop h4 or bishop f4, or do you trade this bishop with bishop takes f6? Fans of the Analyze Your Games class that we do on Twitch later tonight will know that I have had some things to say about bishop takes f6 in other positions, but the question remains, for this specific position, is it a good idea to take on f6 or not? What should white be looking to do here? And I turn it to you, chat room. What do you think? Bishop takes f6 or bishop h4 or bishop f4? Which of these moves appeal to you? Manny says takes looks good because queen can't take. So I assume Manny is referencing the pressure on the d5 pawn, but I will have you note that knight takes d5 is literally illegal. So bishop takes f6, black likely will be responding with queen takes f6. Also, congrats to Manny, who got to 2,000 on Lee Chess today. So we can call him a graduate of the class, maybe. Maybe we can. Maximiliano says it's too complicated. Well, let me show you what Emily played in the game, and we'll see if it matches up with your intuition here. At first glance, probably most people's first reaction is to preserve the bishop. But here, Emily actually does trade the bishop for the knight, and she does so for a very specific reason. Bishop takes and queen takes played in the game. And what is the reason that Emily gives up this dark squared bishop? Well, she's actually playing to pressure this d5 pawn just a little bit. Why is she playing this way? Well, because it makes sense with her previous play. With queen a4 check forcing the knight to c6, now the d5 pawn cannot be very comfortably supported by a pawn on c6. So by removing this knight, which defends d5, for this bishop, which can't attack d5, Emily is successfully increasing the pressure against this d5 pawn. Something else that she's doing is she's actually relieving the pressure of this pin just a little bit. If this bishop were to retreat to h4, you very much have to contend with the idea of g5, bishop g3, and knight e4. Now, all of a sudden, there is, in fact, pressure on this knight on c3. If you play a nonchalant move, perhaps rook c1, just defending the knight, you might get hit with the stunner h5. And what does h5 do? Well, all of a sudden, h4 is a threat, and this bishop is trapped. It's not so comfortable, by the way, to play a move like h4 when knight takes g3 and f takes g3. It is going to ruin your structure and quite possibly your entire weekend. So, no bishop h4 today, no bishop f4 today, largely because these knight e4 threats are strong, but also because bishop takes f6 is perfectly consistent with the way that white has been playing, increasing the pressure on d5. In the game, white now completes development with bishop e2, we see bishop e6, and now white actually asks black to make a decision with her bishop. The same question that was asked to the player with the white pieces is now being asked to the player with the black pieces. Do you trade this bishop or do you keep this bishop? And the answer to this question is actually pretty interesting. So, without a doubt, the most popular option is to end up giving up this bishop for this knight, likely because it really does alleviate a lot of the pressure on the queen side. And this can be done actually in two different ways. First of all, the most direct way is to play bishop takes c3, b takes c3, follow this up with a6, and likely black is looking to play something like b5, get control of c4, and while the black structure on the queen side can be a little bit suspicious, it's not so easy for white either with this pawn back here on c3, rather than on b2 when it can be used in minority attack. Another alternative that is actually slightly more popular is to go bishop d6, but this actually runs into a very powerful move by white, which is the move knight b5, when all of a sudden this bishop might not be surviving the game after all. The most popular way to play here is bishop g4, and white can sort of take this bishop whenever she desires in the game. This didn't happen at all, so I won't say in the game, but one potential continuation is rook to c1, knight e7, knight d6, queen d6, queen b4, and this is a pretty well-known endgame line where white can go b5, fixing the doubled pawns, and black is thought to be about equal here. Now in the game, Annie came up with door number 3, and this is something that actually is not totally a novelty. It has been seen once or twice before, but is very, very much not the standard way of treating the position. She says, why am I giving you my dark squared bishop? I'm going to keep this guy, and she brings it back all the way to e7. Now, what's the problem with this? Obviously, the e7 square is not the ideal square for the bishop. On d6, it pressures the white king side quite thoroughly, and that is sort of what black is playing for in the game here. White has a good structure on the queen side. This knight has made black's structure rather awkward. There's pressure on d5. These pawns both sit undefended, and white is going to look to take advantage of this, whereas black, on the other hand, is largely looking to use these open bishops on these open diagonals and pressure the white king side. So, what is bishop e7? Why keep this bishop at all if it's not going to be useful in the attack? Well, let's see what idea Annie Wang had in mind. Emily starts with the move kingside castles. And now I would like you guys at home to try and find Annie Wang's idea here. What is Annie trying to do with bishop e7? See if you can find some way to make this bishop useful. It's a pretty surprising idea. Manny says maybe get it to c7 later. And the problem with that is that you just don't have time, right? You don't have time to do many things on this queen side here. If you try something like bishop d8, maybe hoping knight e7, c6, bishop c7, the problem is you immediately are running into moves like queen b5, when guess what? That is actually just a fork. Two pieces are attacked at the same time. Tough to defend both of them. This pressure on the queen side is no joke here. It's no joke. And Great Wolf actually has the correct idea here. This is Annie's idea in the game. She does, in fact, want this bishop on this diagonal because it is the best diagonal for the bishop. It pressures the white king side. She wasn't disputing that when she brought it back to e7. She was merely avoiding knight b5. I don't know why I can't say that word, but I can. She was avoiding knight b5, which would be effectively capturing this dark squared bishop. The bishop can't move because of the pressure on c7. So she drops it back to e7 for a turn, and then she plays this move a6. What's the idea of a6? Well, for one, you stop these nasty queen b5 threats, and number two, you are actually stopping knight b5 as well, and we see after white's next move, the natural b4, going for the minority attack. Black brings this bishop back to d6, and after these two slightly, very natural moves, but not the most aggressive moves of all time by white, Black is very much doing okay in this position. It feels as though white maybe missed an opportunity to apply the pressure a little bit more quickly after bishop e7, because if black is allowed to actually keep this bishop on d6, then she's going to have very, very good play against this white king side, as we'll see in the game. So backing up just a couple moves here, let's say instead of kingside castles, white had played queen to b5. I'm not entirely sure what Annie actually had planned in case of this. Maybe even something as active as bringing the bishop back to d6 immediately, which is of course a pretty crazy pawn sacrifice. If queen takes b7, probably knight e7, and white is in fact just up a pawn here. But of course there is still this nasty pressure on the king side, and if knight takes d5, maybe something like queen g6, when again, black is just playing for this king side activity, playing to make some threats on this side of the board. A very nice idea for a rapid game. That being said, if black doesn't go for this bishop d6 idea here, there's still no way to defend both of these pawns, and I think probably this is what white should have gone for in response to bishop e7. And I would imagine this is why we're not seeing bishop e7 played at sort of higher levels, or even just played more often, because a pawn is a pawn. It's not so easy to give those guys up. It's like, if you give up this pawn, you better be sure you're getting a lot of activity for it. But in the game, white played it a bit too slowly, kingside castled, we saw a6 by black, and now after bishop d6, black is once again doing just fine in this position. Queen b3 was a natural move by Emily again, just applying some pressure to the d5 pawn, and now black starts to try and fix her queenside structure by rerouting this knight to a more attacking position on the king side, allowing these pawns a little bit more mobility. No nasty knight on c6 stuck in front of them. Now white continues with the move knight a4, aiming to control this c5 square quite thoroughly. And in the game, I'm not the biggest fan of how Annie decided to treat it. I'm not saying what she did was bad by any means, but I think here knight c5 is a big enough threat that I personally would have liked to just play the move b6 here, stopping knight c5 outright. Or is it actually, because there's still these ideas, but still at the same time, I think b6 was in black's best interest to stop knight c5, and at worst, she can regain her pawn back on c5 here in exchange for the bishop. But okay, no b6 in the game. Instead, she just goes rook a d8, but now after knight c5, she has to play this bishop all the way back to c8, which is not the end of the world, but is maybe not totally ideal. That being said, I'm being a little bit overly critical here. Black, again, is still doing just fine. It's more just personal preference. I would have liked b6 with a little bit more clarity, leaving this knight here on c5 Just feels a little bit scary to my eyes. In the game, Rook F to C1 was played. White again playing for pressure on the queen side, and Black again should be going for ideas on the king side here. She first activates the final rook though, bringing it to the e8 square with some pressure on this bishop on e2. And you might be thinking this move is a little bit more mysterious than the past few moves Black has played. You know, is the rook really so much better on e8 than f8? Shouldn't I be doing more active things on the king's side? And you would have an argument there, although we'll see a little bit later on, this rook is a very, very relevant piece. This rook isn't doing nothing on the e8 square. It has more than one idea of just rook e6, rook g6, right? You know, this idea is a little bit far-fetched, but that's not all this rook does. It guards e4, and on rare days, it attacks an e3 pawn, which may come in handy. a4 played in the game for White, again, going for this minority attack. And Black plays the move knight f5. We continue with b5, and I'll talk about knight f5 in a moment here, but first, White is making some threats on the queen's side, and once again, Black is faced with a decision. How do we meet this b5 advance? We have, you know, quite a few options here. Just to name a few, option number 1, take that dude, get him off the board. Option number 2, push past that dude, leave him on the board. Option number 3, I don't care what White's doing, I am going to go checkmate this king. Moves like knight h4, moves like g5, let me at him. So, what do you think, chat? Which should be played in this case? Chess King likes a5 to close the position. Fair enough. Manny likes b6, a5. It's a bit too late for that, of course. It's a bit too late. The time to play b6 has gone. Great Wolf likes option number 3, specifically in order to play like a psycho cowboy, which is always fun, always fun. And the third person to speak in the chat has chosen the option not yet chosen, which is a takes b5. So the chat room is pretty much split on this one. Pretty much split on this one. So a few people just want to attack quickly, and a couple people like a5, and a takes b5 still only has the one voter. And really, these three branches at this moment, I think objectively, are all okay for Black. You can really take your pick on this one. The question you have to ask yourself is practically, which one is giving my opponent the tougher time? And I think, in fact, a5 is giving the opponent the toughest time, right? a5 is the kind of move where it is effectively slowing down White's counterplay. And when you do effectively slow down the opponent's counterplay, they have to start making some decisions, right? If you just sort of launch with g5 or something, White, doesn't really have to make any decision here. White's like, okay, fine, I'll go b takes a6, start opening things up, and play to win on the queen side of the board, right? You sort of make the decision for White in the case of a move like g5. If you take on b5, again, you are not really forcing your opponent to make decisions. A takes b5 is a very natural move by White, and then White's going to follow it up by invading with the rook, either to a8 or a7, and perhaps dropping this knight back, getting the other rook in the game, and again, the play is going to be very, very natural for White. Whereas when you play the move a5, as Annie did in the game, I think this is a great practical idea, because now it's not so clear what White's plan is on the queen's side. White has a little bit more work to do here to determine how she's planning to actually break through this structure for Black, which is why I think practically a5 is a really, really great idea. So a5 played in the game, not that there's anything too objectively wrong with a move like g5 or even a move like a takes b5. It's just that it makes White's play a little bit more clear. It gives White a little bit more clarity, which is something that I tend to really like avoiding. In the game, knight d3, played by White, still a very nice move, opening up this rook and rerouting the knight to some more happy squares in the center or on the king side, where the knight can both serve as an offensive piece as well as maybe a much needed defensive piece. And here, Black's idea of knight f5 sort of comes a bit more clear. She wanted to go knight h4. Why did she want to go knight h4? She wanted to kill this knight on f3. Why did she want to kill this knight on f3? Because this knight is always a very good defender, guarding this h2 square, and threatening to jump into e5 in many, many variations. So knight e7 to f5 to h4 is just a classic idea to get rid of a defender around white's king. White goes ahead and captures, black captures back. We see g3 now. This is the setup that white chooses to sort of combat black's kingside play. We see this queen come back to f6, which makes sense. Black has provoked a few weaknesses around this king now, and so she's happy just retreating and regrouping while she determines the best path forward. And now white comes up with a really, really interesting idea. Like I said, if you sort of take your time here, it's not really clear how white is exactly planning to break through on this queen side. Black is probably going to avoid playing a move like b6, which gives white the c6 square. So for the moment, these two squares seem off limits to white's pieces, and it's really, really unclear how exactly white is going to break through, as I keep saying. And in the game, Emily found the interesting idea of just playing b6 outright. And b6 is a pretty committal move. Of course, in this case, black's only option is pretty clear here. C takes b6 would open things up far too much on the queen side. This is where black wants to keep things closed, so Annie, of course, immediately plays c6. So, what do we think about this move b6 by Emily? Do you guys in the chat sort of see the idea? On the one hand, you clarify the situation on the queen side. You allow black to keep things closed on the c and the b files. This b pawn is never really going to move, unless, of course, something awful happens to the b7 pawn. But what is white getting in exchange for it? What is the benefit here? What is the benefit? And yeah, Manny is catching the right idea here. It's this a5 pawn. This a5 pawn is a little bit touchy over on the queen side for black. It's not easy to defend, and with this white pawn now on b6, it's pretty unclear how black is planning to defend this guy after the move queen c3. Now, the downside for white is that an a5 pawn is all the way over on the a file, right? And white's king is on the g file. So if we look, the a file on the right and the king on the left, these two places are pretty far apart. And if white starts spending time capturing pawns on a5, she might find herself having a little bit of an issue with her king. And if black had played the move queen g5, this is surprisingly the most accurate move. I would be pretty impressed if the players had found this in the game with the queen just moving back to f6 and now up to g5. Queen takes a5 would actually be a pretty serious mistake here. So who sees why? Black to move and sees the advantage in this position. Wasn't immediately queen g5 better? Well, we'll take a look at it. But for now, let's look at this position with the queen on g5. What is happening here? And yeah, Chess King is doubtful of his own idea, but it is the correct idea in this case. Rook takes e3 is just a very, very powerful move. And that's why I said this little mysterious rook move here does occasionally come quite in handy for the black pieces. It also eyes, by the way, a very weak bishop on e2. So not so easy to meet this move by white. If you take on e3, you do in fact just straight lose after bishop takes g3, when all of a sudden these two bishops, which are lurking in black's camp, suddenly are just checkmating the white king. If you take this, then check, king h1, and the simple move, bishop f5, is good enough to win the game. Rook f1 is the only way to not get mated. And here, rook d6, the last rook joins the fray, and Emily would have gone down in a glorious fashion. So white has to not take the rook and go something like bishop f1. By the way, if you take, and try not capturing this piece, things don't really get better for you. Something like bishop h4 check and queen f6. Things are just nasty, nasty, nasty here. So that would have been a pretty incredible move, but Annie Wang plays a slightly more natural-looking bishop f5, just bringing the bishop into the attack as well. And now white calls the bluff. She takes on a5. And now it's up to Annie to decide how to continue the attack, right? She's sacrificed this a5 pawn in order to draw the queen far away from the king. And now she has to figure out, how do you actually make tangible threats against the white king side? So what do you think, chat? How do you actually make tangible threats against the white king? What to do here? Turning it back to you again. By the way, yeah, notably, all of these attacking ideas for Annie are sort of made possible due to the fact that she still has this dark squared bishop on d6. So her opening little gambit, I'll call it, because it was sort of a risk to play bishop e7 when white has these good ideas like queen b5. Her opening gambit has, in fact, paid off here. She's kept her bishop, and she has a nice little attacking game. Manny says bishop e4 to provoke f3. I think bishop e4 would be great if white were forced to play f3, but of course white is not forced to play f3. White can likely just retreat the queen back somewhere to, you know, reasonable territory, and the game would continue. So I sort of have set your expectations maybe a bit too high for black's position with this rook e3 idea. Really, those types of sacrifices are rarely going to work against this structure for white. Unless you are just crashing through on the g3 square rather immediately, white can sort of come back and defend, right? So what do we need? Well, we need some way to break down this structure for white. And the way to do that isn't actually with piece threats. Making threats with the pieces is actually pretty difficult in this position, right? Like bishop e4, queen h3, there's just bishop f1, and that itself is hard to sort of manufacture. And, you know, there's just no way to make threats with the pieces here. Like rook e6 isn't really doing anything. So the thing to do is introduce a pawn into the attack with the move h5. We use this pawn sort of as, you know, our battering ram to crash through on the g3 square and soften up these squares around the white king. Now, Emily plays a very interesting move. She plays knight c5, just going directly for activity against this black b7 pawn. Annie, of course, continues with the move h4. Now, deciding it's perhaps time to defend her king, Emily plays queen d2, adding some extra support to the e3 pawn. H takes g3 is very natural. H takes g3, and now we have this position. And I do like the move that Annie plays in the game. The engine sort of says it's not the best move ever, but I mean, in a position like this, I think queen g5 is a very, very human move to make, and I think it's perfectly fine here. You just bring the queen into the attack against this g3 pawn and give your opponent tangible threats to solve. Now in the game, Emily plays bishop f3, which is a very logical move, allowing the queen to defend along the second rank. And now Annie does actually have to make a rather unfortunate move. As I've said, unfortunate a few times now. She decided she has to take this knight, which I think is the correct call here, because otherwise this knight is just taking on b7, and black is just losing the game outright unless she has some crazy checkmate, which in this case I don't think she does. So having to take this knight gives up a lot of her pressure on the dark squares, but after rook takes c5, she still finds some way to keep the attack going. How should she keep the attack going? Well, of course, as I'm sure you guys in the chat know, you have to get the rooks into the game. So now that she has opened up this h-file, allowing her rooks to occupy it, she once again trades off a bishop to slow down white's pressure and is now going for the throat. White, for her part, is not intimidated by this attack at all and just plays the move a5, trying to get counterplay on the queen's side. Rook h6 by Annie Wang is the natural follow-up. Queen e2 is Emily's choice, guarding this bishop a little more thoroughly. By the way, if you don't play queen e2, if you just pass, for example, then perhaps bishop g4 was a little bit of a threat when the queen could come to h5 to follow. So queen e2 stops any bishop g4 ideas, and we see Annie play a pretty interesting move once again, which is queen g6. She's going for some light squares around the queen, some light squares around the king, oh, not that move, and some potential queen h7 ideas, as well as invading on this diagonal. So just a nice little solid move, sneaky attacking move, presenting more options for her pieces. Queen f1 is what Emily chose in the game, and now bishop h3 for Annie. The bishop comes back to g2, and the bishop comes back to g4. So a little bit of back and forth here by the players. They were getting pretty low on time. White continues with the move f3 now, which again is a pretty committal idea. Like Manny in the chat said, if we could provoke f3 from white, that would be great, and that's exactly what Annie managed to do here. By the way, if you don't play f3, if you play something like h6, then queen h5 is sort of just killing your king. So f3 by Emily was a nice find in time pressure to keep the game going. Now queen h5 is the very active idea by Annie Wang, once again going for the throat. Don't even think about touching this bishop. Queen h2 check, rook f6 check, and bishop f3 is illegal, so your queen is dead. So queen h5, nice move. King f2 by Emily, again a nice move. Both players finding really great moves under time pressure. This king needs to evacuate as soon as possible. Rook f6 was the move that Annie came up with to keep the pressure on. Queen h1 was again an accurate defensive move by Emily, guarding this f3 pawn with the queen and offering the queen trade. Queen f5 kept the pressure up for black. And now, unfortunately, Emily does crack under the pressure, as we have seen happen with numerous players in this tournament when the clock starts ticking down, right? These players are capable of some really incredible chess, as we've actually seen in this game, but once that clock gets below 2-3 minutes, it gets very, very tough to keep playing your best chess. And here, I think, unfortunately, Emily plays the move e4, and this, I think, is a move she would like to have back. Of course, black can just capture this pawn with the queen, the pin is maintained, and everything now is falling around this white king, and it is just going to be checkmate shortly. Queen d1 played, queen e3 check, king f1, bishop f3, and Emily does resign. But let's take a second here before the move e4 and see if we can find an improvement for Emily. So white to move and actually keep a very, very nice advantage in the position. See what you guys think. See what you think. Not e4, says Chess King, and he would be correct. a6 does keep the game going, a6 is not bad. Rook a2 I'm not sure I'm a fan of, so let's look at what happens if you play some move like rook a2, right? I think black's idea may be g5, which is sort of crazy, right? It's sort of crazy to expect g5, but I think black does have this very nice attacking idea. If black didn't have this idea, I think white could sort of play anything and just be fine. But with this idea, things are a little bit tougher. So of course, what's the point? Well, the point is bishop f3 and g4. And things are not so easy. Things are not so easy for white here. If you play a7, for example, queen d3, and this is looking a lot like checkmate. So I think white's best move in the position is actually the move rook c3, with the idea that now after something like g5, this rook is doing a lot to defend the king. There's no queen d3 idea anymore, and the white king is going to stay a bit safer. You can follow this up now with a6, and if black tries the same, a7 for example, now it's just a lot tougher to make any tangible threats around this king. For example, queen e4 is still trying, but perhaps the king can run away, with white just barely covering everything, and now running out of threats, black will have to abandon the attack to stop the a-pawn, and white would of course be winning. So definitely can't really fault Emily for missing this one. I do wonder though if Annie saw this idea of g5 to keep the attack going. It's a really interesting one, and it would have been fun to see how this game ended if the players had a little bit more time on the clocks. That being said, Annie kept her cool under the pressure, and Emily was the first to crack with the move e4, which does just lose the game. So really impressive game from both of these players. I really liked Annie's opening idea here with bishop e7. Of course, this move queen b5 by white would have been an interesting idea to try and refute it, but she just goes bishop e7, a6, bishop d6, says, all right, I kept my bishop, best of luck to you. Best of luck to you. So really impressive game by Annie. And yeah, for her part, Emily played very, very well for the vast majority of the game, and then really did just slip up with this last move here. So I am going to move along now to another game, and I felt like it might be a good idea to take a look, check in with our current U.S. Women's Champion. I, of course, am talking about the one, the only Jennifer Yu, reigning champ, coming in to defend her title here against, a very, very, very strong field. So Jennifer, of course, was a bit of an underdog in the tournament when she won the title, but we'll see if she can actually defend her title this year. She's off to not the worst start in the world. I think she has 2 points or 1.5. I don't know. The standings are tough to keep straight. We're on like tournament number 4 in October here. I can't remember the standings of all of them, but let's just look at this game that she had against Martha Samadashvili. So this game goes e4, c5, knight c3, so not the normal stuff so far, knight c6, knight f3, but then after e6, we do get an open type Sicilian with the move d4, cd4, and knight d4. So we are in a Paulson at this point, and this used to be a little bit of a blind spot in my chess knowledge. I never really got too into all of the Sicilians. Then I did a 10-part series on the Najdorf, and I feel a little bit more confident talking about some of these things now. So we'll see how I do here. We'll see how I do. Queen c7, and white plays a very offbeat move here. Of course, bishop e3 is main stuff, bishop e2, you can fianchetto, you can go f4, you can even go knight b5, you can even take this, but white chooses the slightly strange looking move, queen to d3. So what is the point of queen to d3? Well, of course, you get the queen off the back rank, introducing some ideas of queenside castles. You also defend this e-pawn a little bit more thoroughly, and you just gain a lot more control of a lot of light squares. In the game, a6 was played, keeping the knight out of b5. By the way, if you don't play something like a6, white very much is going to consider going knight d to b5 now, and queen g3 is another big idea with bringing this queen out to d3. You activate this queen and put on some pressure. Black likely isn't going to be very happy with taking this guy, because now there's no comfortable solution to this idea of knight c7. For example, rook b8 means bishop f4, and e5 means bishop g5. So some tricky stuff from Jennifer Yu to start off with, coming queen d3 with this nice queen g3 idea, as well as just general control over the light squares, and black responds accurately with the move a6, keeping the knight out of b5 altogether, and making sure these ideas don't come to fruition. We do see knight takes c6 now, though, and black really has her option of how she wants to take this. I think all 3 captures are reasonable, but she chose queen takes c6. By the way, if something like b takes c6, again, we would likely see this queen g3 idea come into play, with white getting the queens off the board and going for some kind of endgame. So queen c6 played instead. Now bishop e2 comes on the board. Again, queen g3 was playable, but Jennifer decides against it. We see b5 by Martha, bishop out to f3 now with some e5 ideas. Bishop b7 is Martha's response, and she's just going to meet e5 with queen c7 and call it a day. Although this is what happens in the game, and maybe we'll see that this e5 pawn is granting Jennifer Yu a little bit of a spatial advantage. So queen c7, Jennifer trades off these bishops and just castles kingside. Black goes knight e7, trying to complete development, and white goes knight e4, aiming for this slightly weak d6 square and making use of this extra central space with the e5 pawn. Knight g6 is the response by Martha, going after this pawn and guarding this square. Now knight d6 would be a bit of a mistake because white really isn't interested in having the queen here. It's just going to get evicted by rook c8 to c6, and a pawn on d6 is perhaps going a little bit too far. This pawn is likely going to fall, as it is just a little bit too overextended into black's camp. So f4 instead keeps this pawn covered and keeps the threats alive. We have bishop e7, bishop e3. White improves her queen to c6. We say rook a to d1, and then castles kingside by black, and we are arriving at a middle game position here. I think it's safe to say both players pretty much fully developed, and we are entering the middle stage of the game. So, what do you guys think about this position? What strikes you as interesting about this one in particular? And what do you think both players are going for? Just give me your general thoughts on the position, chat, and we'll talk a little bit about what you think and about what I think and why you guys are wrong and I'm right all the time. At least, you know, half the time, maybe? Isn't d7 hanging? Well, you do have to be on the lookout here. You take this guy, I take this guy. It's tough. It's tough. Oh, castles. So yeah, the knight on e4 is a bit loose. Have to be a little careful of that one. White has space. White does have space. White does have space. The e4 knight looks iffy. So interesting that you guys are now focusing on this e4 knight. So that is, I think, a great way to kind of evaluate this position. There are, of course, two things that should be pretty obvious, right? White is, of course, trying to pressure the d7 pawn, and black, of course, is trying to pressure the c2 pawn along the c file. So this is a very important factor in the position, taking a look at black's play on the c file and white's play on the d file. But on top of that, you can usually determine how good a position is for a player by the placement of their minor pieces. So do we like white's minor pieces here, or do we like black's minor pieces? This is, I think, a great way to at least start evaluating a position. A great way to start. And maybe, just maybe, it'll lead us to the best move. Things We Love says black, Black Cat says whites, Manny says whites, Nightmare says white, Chess King says white, Patrick Daly says white. So, I do in fact think white has some advantage here, and the large difference is between the knights. White's knight on e4 might be a little bit loose, but it does have very strong, jumps forward, right? It's controlling a lot of squares. Whereas black's knight is sort of in a pretty sad state here on g6. However, I think it does have maybe one idea, which is on some days it can actually go knight h4 and over to g6. g4 might be playable for white to try to keep him out, but g4 is a little bit overcommittal, right? Now all of a sudden, white is the one with the weak king, and you do have to be a bit cautious. So, for that reason, I think the best move in this position is actually the simple move g3. And I think this is a really instructive idea to take away. The placement of the minor pieces is a crucial part of any early middle game, and in fact any position in general. And by taking advantage of the fact that this knight is so out of play, white is able to prove a pretty significant advantage, in my opinion. For example, some of black's best tries now involve going something like f6 and actually just giving up this bishop for the knight and giving up on the d7 pawn as well. And of course, white has a pretty substantial advantage here. Queen takes c2 is playable, but now with very active major pieces and black's pieces still looking a little bit uncoordinated, I think white should be a lot better in this position. Just one example continuation line, rook f to e1, queen takes b2 for example, and bishop d4, right? So you can't even take on b2 because of that. If you go queen c4, then let's say a simple bishop f2, queen a2, and gosh, I don't know, just queen c7, rook d7, come take stuff. And yeah, white's pieces are just more active than black's, so I think white has some advantage here. In the game, though, Jennifer Yu decides she's not afraid of knight h4 and just goes rook f2. And that being said, if black can't play knight h4, then I think I definitely agree. White is maintaining the advantage here for all the reasons that we just talked about, right? You know, this minor piece is just a lot better than this minor piece, and it's going to show eventually, as we shall see. So why not knight g4? Well, perhaps Martha was actually a little bit concerned about this g4 idea, or perhaps she thought that her knight just didn't really have the future that she wants for it on the f5 square. Like, best case, it's trading off of this bishop. I personally think knight h4 would have been worth it for Martha. You really have to get this knight back into the game, and we'll see in the game that she just doesn't quite get there. Rook ac8 played, and now we see a second reason why I do think white has the better position. Both players have their pressure against their respective pawns on their respective files, but only white is able to play this move c3. Black, unfortunately, cannot play d5 or d6, and so while white can go c3 and at least slow down black's counterplay over here, black has no such options for the pawn on d7, and I think this is yet another reason why this position is a little bit better for white. Queen c4 was played in the game, and now b3 by Jennifer Yu forces the queen back. If you take on d3, I think you may end up with a pretty big problem on the d7 pawn. For example, rook c7, d2, rook d8, bishop b6 isn't going to be holding this guy, and so it's just tough. So queen c6 played instead. Now b4 was played in the game, locking down b4 from black, which would of course open the c file. And now once again, we see white sort of stemming black's play against the c3 pawn, making use of this centralized knight, whereas black's minor pieces still not doing a lot, and this d pawn still quite weak. Rook f d8 is played. And now Jennifer Yu makes a really interesting decision, and that is to go bishop c5, allowing bishop takes c5 and knight takes c5. So what do you think of this move, bishop c5 by Jennifer Yu? Good move or bad move? Good idea or bad idea? Doesn't it allow d5? No. d5 I can still play, e takes d6. Ties the rook down to f4, sure. Sure. Bad, d6 is weak. I'm a little confused. A little confused what you mean, Chess King. A little confused. Good, d7 weak. So I think this is a bad move, and you can look at it specifically, and you can look at it principled. Oh, you wanted to put the knight on d6 instead? Yeah, but I don't think that's the most relevant thing here. I think the most relevant thing here is the principle this is violating is trading pieces when you have extra space. And the specifics of it come down to what a few people in the chat room are mentioning. This knight did not have access to the e7 square, and now it does. And we see this knight sort of re-enter the game from g6, where it was effectively useless. It was effectively not serving any purpose at all on g6, especially with g3 sort of coming. Whereas if white had played a little bit of a slower move here, something like rook f to d2, just keeping the pressure on this guy on d7, something like queen b7, g3, giving white a little bit of time, we can keep this piece effectively locked out of the game and keep the pressure on the d7 pawn. And I would have much rather seen something like this from Jennifer Yu, keeping this knight out of the game, not rushing things quite so much, and just keeping the pressure alive. But after bishop c5, takes, now the knight does get back into e7, but Jennifer Yu is still, a little bit favored here because she does have all this extra space, even if she's now only playing against one minor piece rather than both of them. So she continues very actively with the move g4, which I definitely don't mind at all. Now queen c7 and queen g3, routing this queen finally, as we saw in the opening, over to g3 with the same idea. And she is just going for the kingside attack now. For her credit, though, Martha now has survived to a point where she is able to play the move d6 and get rid of this weak pawn on d7. And this is sort of as a result of Jennifer Yu kind of giving up on just locking the position, holding it down with moves like Rook d2, and offering up this trade of bishops. Now it's just too tough to keep all of this pressure on d7 with only one minor piece on the board, and Martha is breaking free. That being said, pawn is a pawn. Jennifer Yu snaps on a6 and says, I will take that, thank you very much. Queen b6 is met with rook takes d6, takes. And now, if you take my knight, I will take your knight. If you move your knight, I will save my knight. So, queen takes d6, knight c5, and now knight d5 is a bit of a misstep by Martha, but nothing too serious. And I think in this position, Martha is actually doing just fine if she plays a few active moves, such as queen d1, coming into d2 after rook f1. Something like queen d5 as well, I think is also fine. But knight d5 perhaps allows a little bit of pressure on the d file. That being said, I think black is totally fine in this position. White does have optically more space on the king's side and more threats, but now one set of rooks has been traded, there's only knights on the board, the bishops are gone, and I don't think white really has enough firepower to justify the weaknesses in her position, right? Black has this one weak pawn on c6, but we see c3 could be weak, a2 could potentially be weak, f4 is potentially weak, and there is a potential weakness around white's king as well. So I think here, black has actually done a very good job of sort of getting out of the trapped-looking position that she was in. That being said, though, knight d5, once again, might be a little bit of a misstep because queen d3 is quite strong, putting pressure on this queen. And now after queen c7, white to move and once again play for the advantage. White to move and play for the advantage. I won't ask you guys for too long on this one. We are running short on time, but yeah, Patrick Daly immediately has the idea, which is the move f5. And I think practically this is the best that white can do. Now, objectively, I think black is still doing okay, but practically, definitely you would rather be white after the move f5, right? White is just having all the threats, and black is going to have to work pretty hard not to let any of those threats actually come crashing through. Now, if white had played something like queen takes b5, knight takes f4, at this point I think, again, it's going to be anybody's game, when this is less about white attacking black's king and more just about these three pawns on the queen side versus black's extra pawns on the king side. And now, once again, it's going to be white who has to worry about her king, and practically that's just never fun. You would rather be the attacker. So I like f5 by Jennifer Yu. Knight f4 still comes into the position, and now queen e3, e5 is trying to keep things locked down. Rook d2, though, is now seizing the open file. Rook d8 is challenging that, but now finally, once again, we see that the player who has been under some pressure, once the clocks start to get low, mistakes start to be made, and who sees the problem with rook d8? Who sees the problem? And yeah, Patrick Daly has the answer. Rook d8, unfortunately, hangs the tactic of queen takes e5, when now black is sort of helpless to stop dual threats, right? Dual threats. You can't take the queen, because this looks a lot like checkmate, and you can't take the rook, because that hangs both the queen and checkmate, unfortunately. Martha found the only way to keep the game going, which is knight h3 check, king f1, queen to c8. But now, with the death of the e5 pawn, black is going to have a very tough time in this position, especially without a rook to increase the threats against white's king. Jennifer Yu just pushes her majority, trades on f6, trades the queens, and now 2 pawns is 2 pawns. 2 pawns is 2 pawns. a4, b5, king d6, b6, and Martha resigns. So pretty tough game here for Martha. She was under a lot of pressure from the opening, and then just when she was beginning to see the light, just when she began to come out with d6 and d5 freeing her position, freeing her pieces. Unfortunately, that is when the tactic was found by Jennifer Yu. It's when this F5 move came, and she just kept up the pressure. Despite Martha glimpsing that light, she could almost reach out and grab the draw, but she could not. It was just not meant to be, as Jennifer Yu did an excellent job playing good practical chess. And in my opinion, that's the thing we are seeing from the US Women's Championship this year, as well as all the other championships that have already finished, right? What's winning is not always objective best chess, but it is the best practical chess that is prevailing. The practical players are having their time to shine, especially in this rapid format, online format. That's where good, practical, solid chess really comes in handy. You don't always need to play the best move. You don't always need to play, the solid move. Sometimes the tricky move is good enough. Sometimes the aggressive move, just putting pressure on the clock, on the board, every place you can, is going to be enough to win the game. Okay, so thank you all so much for joining me here on the road to 2000. The fun is going to continue directly after this with the endgame class. I would encourage you all to tune in to that one, and please join me there. I'm going to be going over everything you ever wanted to know and everything you ever didn't want to know about opposite colored bishop endgames. That's right, we're going to start from the bare bones of it and work up from there, and eventually, hopefully if we have time, take a look at a really interesting endgame between the world champion Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura. Who doesn't love looking at games between those two? So please go check it out. That's it for here on the road to 2000. Once again, thank you so much for watching. My name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.